Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's November 22nd, 2025. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. Peter Thiel has been giving lectures on the Antichrist. We're going to discuss his arguments. First, I want to start with some etymology of the word. It's a Greek term, antichristos, from two terms, anti, as in against or in place of, and Christos, as in the anointed one or Christ. So it literally means one who opposes or replaces Christ. The word Antichrist appears only in 1st and 2nd John, not the Gospel John, and it's not in Revelation either. So I'm going to go through the verses in with the NIV translation. 1 John 2:18, Dear children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. 1 John 2:22, Who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son. 1 John 4:3, But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. 2 John 1:7, I say this because many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist. So in these passages, Antichrist refers to anyone who denies the incarnation or divinity of Jesus, plural and ideological, not yet a single end times figure. Then later, Christian writers, or early Christian writers, connected the Antichrist with other apocalyptic images. So 2 Thessalonians mentions the, quote, man of lawlessness, and then Revelations 13 references the, quote, beast and the, quote, false prophet.
Quick little pedantic interjection here. It is not the Gospel of John, but it is presumed to be the same author. These are the epistles of John, the same one who wrote the Gospel of John. And in that context, Antichrist, it had not garnered, in the time of the New Testament, it hadn't garnered the proper noun status that it gained during the Reformation, and that it is in the common vernacular associated with today. The idea that the Antichrist is a particular force or even a particular individual. In the case of the epistles of John, it was talking about just any sort of energy that was opposed to Christ, opposed to Christianity, or opposed to the nature of God's intention for man. Something more diffuse, I would argue, in the time of the New Testament than it would solidify into the conception of medieval Christians and into the conceptions that Christians today have of the term Antichrist.
Yes, so the actual term Antichrist appears only in 1st and 2nd John, and it originally meant anyone denying Jesus as the Christ, not a single individual. And then later writers retconned the term into Revelation and 2 Thessalonians, merging it with the beast and the man of lawlessness. And then over time, Antichrist came to mean a single global deceiver who opposes Christ and dominates the world before the second coming. And one other important term is katakon. It is Greek for the restrainer or that which holds back. And this term is used in 2 Thessalonians. It refers to someone or something that restrains the man of lawlessness or the Antichrist, and that has been attributed to various entities over the years. Originally, some early Christian writers associated it with the Roman Empire, and then it was also associated with the Holy Spirit or the Christian church itself.
I think that term is probably notable in its importance to Peter Thiel and his theology, such as it is, but in terms of common understanding and common parlance, I don't think it has 1/100th the salience today that the idea of the Antichrist does.
So now getting back to the Peter Thiel lectures. So brief background, Peter Thiel was one of the co-founders of PayPal, and he's been in the 90s and 2000s, he ran one of the top venture capitalist firms, and I believe he was an early investor in Facebook, and he's provided seed money for a lot of successful Silicon Valley companies. And in September or October of this year, he's been giving these four-part lecture series that has been they were given in San Francisco, and they've been somewhat secretive and limited, but it's leaked out. Information about the lectures has leaked out. And so I'm drawing from a Guardian article dated October 10th, 2025. Peter Thiel is worried about the Antichrist. It could be the United States. It could be Greta Thunberg. A quote from Peter Thiel in these lectures. What I will focus on is the most common and most dramatic interpretation of Antichrist, an evil king or tyrant or anti-Messiah who appears in the end times. Peter Thiel describes himself as a libertarian or a classical liberal, and he's an important figure, I guess, to us because we've talked about often on the Reality Taboo about elite theory and the theory or concept of counter elites, and whether the Trump administration, at least Trump 47, represents a insurgent elite class represented by figures such as Peter Thiel and Elon Musk.
I think elite insurgents is a better way of thinking about it than counter elites, because in elite theory, this is not some idea that they are wanting to overthrow the hierarchical social structure. It is just that they are elites who feel that the managerial consensus needs to be changed, and they leverage that elite power to elbow out other elites. This is the 21st century version of the Game of Thrones type of medieval court politics.
And Peter Thiel's most direct connection to the Trump administration is J.D. Vance. Peter Thiel was an early benefactor for J.D. Vance, gave him, from what I can kind of understand, a no-show job and a real cushy job in Silicon Valley, and I believe helped him get Hillbill Elegy attention and get it published, and really helped J.D. Vance enter into the political conversation and helped him with his Senate campaign in Ohio, and presumably was working behind the scenes to convince Trump to pick him as his vice president. So the lectures appear to be somewhat meandering, but there is a few key points that that Peter Thiel has maintained pretty steadily over the years and in these lectures, and that one of them is the unification of the world under one global state is essentially identical to the Antichrist. And in his talks, he uses the term Antichrist almost interchangeably with one world state. And Thiel believes that Armageddon will be ushered in by an Antichrist-type figure who cultivates a fear of existential threats such as climate change, AI, and nuclear war to amass inordinate power. And so he associates international bodies like the United Nations and the International Criminal Court as hastening the coming of Armageddon. And he believes that the Antichrist will be a single evil tyrant. He's not clear about who that is. He doesn't know, or he doesn't claim to know. And he does suggest that the Antichrist will be a Luddite who wants to stop all science. As I mentioned earlier, Thiel has very close connections with J.D. Vance. And interestingly, Peter Thiel describes himself as, quote, very pro J.D. Vance, as to be expected. But the concern that Thiel expressed about J.D. Vance was his allegiance to the Pope. And Thiel is concerned about a Caesar-Papist fusion. So I guess he thinks that if J.D. Vance becomes president and forms too close of a relationship with the Pope, that could be a very dangerous thing. In the lectures, Peter Thiel also discusses the connection between Silicon Valley and D.C., and talks about Gavin Newsom. So quoting from Peter Thiel, Silicon Valley is really, really separate from DC in an extreme way. If these things could be fused, someone like that, meaning Gavin Newsom, perhaps represents a way to do that. In a way, San Francisco is more important than California. And if you could fuse Washington and San Francisco, that's a very dangerous thing.
It seems like that's something that has already occurred. I don't know how a description of that fusion would not be applicable to the Biden administration. And that was one of the reasons that Kamala Harris was such a desirable pick, her electability aside, in terms of being able to fuse that California, Silicon Valley side of the managerial class with the DC, more blue-blooded side of the managerial class, and fusing those two things together. And part of the theory that we have crafted here and have referred to multiple times in previous recordings on the Reality Taboo is about that elite insurgency and the sense, not just by Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, but among many other tech entrepreneurs, that they were doing all of the heavy lifting, that effectively they were the ones who deserved the elite status because they actually created things and were propelling society forward and propelling America forward, while there was this deadweight loss on the DC side, on the other side of the country, the eastern seaboard, of managerial elites that were sclerotic and ensconced and not doing anything and not creating any value and not keeping the American empire competitive into the future. And so for him to talk about how this fusion could happen with someone like Gavin Newsom is interesting, to talk about how that would be something that he would be fearful of. And I assume, without the full context, that what he was arguing here was that Gavin Newsom would effectively be controlled by DC and use his connections with Silicon Valley to have Silicon Valley be subservient to DC, and people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and even people that Peter Thiel has had falling out with, like Mark Andreessen. I think all of them would prefer that the power base be in Silicon Valley, because that's where the actual power and technology and know-how, industriousness resides.
Quoting Peter Thiel again, but Silicon Valley was the one sector of the economy that went all in for Obama, but it didn't work at all. And then if you fast forward to the Obama cabinet, there were 0 people from Silicon Valley. There was no representation at all. And so even Obama was very far from anything resembling a fusion. And then the question is whether Newsom will be like that or different. So yeah, as Ness mentioned, that's kind of ignoring the intervening Democratic president of the Biden administration, which, as Ness laid out, seems like it would represent a pretty clear fusion of Silicon Valley and DC, especially with Kamala Harris being from California, being the Attorney General of California and Senator from California before becoming Vice President.
Yeah, we saw this with the Twitter files that Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger, through assists from Elon Musk, revealed to the public that during the Biden administration, there were effectively agents of that administration that were strong-armed into paid positions in Silicon Valley firms to effectively turn those things in, or to the extent that they could, turn those things into editorial arms of the Washington power structure.
Yes, and most of the most high-profile cases of censorship were relating to COVID misinformation or disinformation. At least that's how the Biden administration defined it. And we're not going to get into all that today, but there were specific instances of multiple specific posts that the Biden administration demanded that Silicon Valley companies remove, such like on Facebook and on Twitter. Thiel stated in his lectures that the creation of the gun and the machine gun, quote, wounded our faith in science and tech, and in some sense, in 1945, science and tech became apocalyptic. It left us with a question. And this fear of tech is what the Antichrist will seize on to gain power, Thiel says. And I'm not sure how much Thiel directly discussed AI. I know he certainly talked about it in his lectures, but based on everything he said, I think he would identify all of these forces seeking to stifle AI, all of the guardrails that Ness and I have witnessed firsthand when we're using AI to try to help us prepare for episodes or create images that there are just, it seems like in the last year, there have been more and more guardrails and more times using ChatGPT, and they just deny they won't talk about certain things, or often it's the most guardrails are when you try to create images. And so Peter Thiel I would say would associate that with the Antichrist, that force or that tendency to continue to stifle people's ability to use this amazing new emerging technology. He would certainly associate that with the Antichrist. And the Biden administration, I want to say in 2021, issued an executive order essentially demanding that equity, and I would describe it as wokeness or far left ideology, liberalism, whatever you want to call it, that be embedded into the very foundation of AI. And so that the chatbot's foundation is a very specific liberal woke ideology. And Peter Thiel, of course, opposes that. And Elon Musk certainly does. Elon Musk spoke about that when he was being interviewed by Joe Rogan. He talked about how every AI chatbot except Grok essentially values white lives far, far less than Asian and Black and Hispanic lives. And they were able to quantify it to where it was clearly the thumb was being pushed on the scale, and that essentially the AI chatbots were valuing non-white lives over white lives. And that's the kind of thing that I believe Peter Thiel would associate with the Antichrist.
The opposition to the DC managerial class trying to control the inputs and therefore the outputs of this budding AI revolution is something that resonates and I'm simpatico with, but the putative topic here is the Antichrist. It feels more like this is Peter Thiel is the topic here, and maybe I'm being overly cynical in terms of this 4-part lecture series, self-styled as he laid it out. There are some questions that come up, immediate basic journalistic questions. For one, he's giving lectures on the Antichrist, which is a very specific, it's not just a general religious term, it is a very specific Christian term, and I would argue even more emphatically it is a Protestant term more than a term that is emphasized in Catholicism, and this is being given in Silicon Valley by a tech billionaire, such that the presumed recipients of the lecture that are hearing this thing that is advertised as being private, but of course Peter Thiel is the founder of Palantir, and so he obviously knows that there is no way to keep this secret, that people are bringing in their cell phones, that even if they turn them off, they're recording everything that he's saying, and all the alphabet intelligence agencies are picking up on it, and Peter Thiel's competitors and allies in Silicon Valley are able to get it and record it and transmit it. And so it has to be a gimmick. There's no way that even though he demanded that there not be any recordings and that it be private so that only the people who paid for entry were able to hear it, he had to have intended otherwise for it to get out. But for a lecture or a series of lectures about a Protestant Christian topic to be given in one of the more atheistic or at least not committed religious areas of the country is incongruent, or at least seemingly so at first blush. To put it mildly, it would be like there being some lecture series about the 72 different gender orientations, the cutting edge of gender orientations being given in a Baptist church in rural Alabama or something. And so it seems to me to make more sense that this is Peter Thiel to, again, put this in the elite insurgency framework. Peter Thiel making moves to ensure that Silicon Valley and the brains behind Silicon Valley are the ones who are in control of artificial intelligence, and that it not be dictated by managerial state actors in Washington, D.C. and their puppets like Gavin Newsom. That, at least, is how I read this. in a much less religious and much more secular context. Also, it should be noted that Peter Thiel is openly homosexual. And so a term like Antichrist, which might be associated more with fundamentalist Christianity, does seem like it would be a little bit at odds there.
What Ness is saying opens up perhaps a more cynical interpretation of what Peter Thiel is doing here. He is a co-founder of Palantir and presumably still has tremendous financial investment in Palantir. And so if he can get more evangelical Christians to connect any sort of stifling of Palantir or Silicon Valley more broadly, if he can get Christians to associate that with the Antichrist, then that could help him sort of co-opt the MAGA movement and make sure that the MAGA movement stays on the side of no regulation of Silicon Valley. Drawing from another Guardian article from, this one's from October 13th, 2025, quote, or the title of the article, "The Antichrist has long haunted American politics. Now it's rearing its head again." This article discusses, or sort of puts Peter Thiel's lecture on the Antichrist in a broader historical context, specifically the United States. So quoting from this article, "The symbol is elastic," and the symbol being the Antichrist. "For a century, Christian apocalypticists have alternated between expecting a singular charismatic ruler and warning that a globalized administrative order, often buttressed by new technologies, could institutionalize the beast's control. The word itself is a vocabulary for fear, a way of translating the headlines of the day into a cosmic drama that explains who we are and what we must do."
You might detect a little bit of projection there because, of course, this is from The Guardian, and the same thing could be characterized with how institutions like The Guardian, which is the British equivalent of the New York Times, filters everything through the lens of racial and sexual oppression and effectively treats wokeism as a guiding principle for which everything needs to be viewed through, and for which any sort of spiritual grounding that has roots in tradition, in particular in European tradition through Christianity, is an obvious threat to that viewpoint espoused by outlets like The Guardian and other neoliberal culture-shaping institutions.
Yes, The Guardian certainly has its own agenda, and it's very wise to take everything they write and report with a large grain of salt. Nevertheless, I think that quote is a pretty good description of what Peter Thiel is doing here. I'm going to read that quote again. "The word itself, being Antichrist, is a vocabulary for fear, a way of translating the headlines of the day into a cosmic drama that explains who we are and what we must do." And another quote from the article, "Once your opponents become eschatological villains, the normal habits of politics and pluralism feel like complicity with evil." And I think that is what Peter Thiel is doing here. He's taking maybe somewhat pedestrian topics of technology regulation and giving them a cosmic flair and raising the stakes and presenting something that will hurt his company, equating that with the Antichrist.
Or simultaneously, more cynically and also more charitably for Peter Thiel, it is to employ language and concepts for that elite insurgency that are as grandiose and cosmic in scope as the kind of arguments that institutions like The Guardian have taken for granted for the better part of 70 years, talking about climate change and racism and all of these other things that take on a sort of metaphysical, spiritual, existential elements to them that are not just presented as gritty, mundane, sort of debased concerns, but are on a cosmic scale because people like Guardian readers and writers are concerned about things of cosmic importance, while somebody like Peter Thiel is just concerned with accruing power and riches for himself. That's the framing, and I think there is a battle going on between the Peter Thiel elite insurgency and the more ensconced global managerial class that the Guardian represents.
A lot of the utility of the term Antichrist is its elasticity, its ambiguity, I think, which we addressed in with the scriptural passages. The term it's not crystal clear what the Antichrist is and what form it will take and when it will come. I think that's part of its utility, though. I actually thought of the term we discussed several episodes ago, Heritage American, where the term is not exactly very clearly defined. Does it mean just white people, just white Americans, or can it be broadened out to include Black Americans, Native Americans? How recently do you have to be able to trace your or how far back do you have to trace your ancestors in North America to claim the title of Heritage American? Is the term Antichrist similarly vague enough where it can be deployed as a general pejorative for the person using it to attack something that they dislike? And like we were saying, give it a more, rather than just call it bad or evil, you give it a more cosmic tone or tenor by calling it the Antichrist. You raise the stakes when you call something the Antichrist. Because in a Christian context, what could be more evil and nefarious than a force that opposes the Son of God?
The question there, though, is why is that the term that is being chosen? Because, of course, there is a term that is far more familiar to most people, Christians and non-Christians alike, that would have presumably served the same purpose and had an even more escalated cosmic significance, and that would be Satan or Lucifer or the devil, Mephistopheles, Beelzebub. There are all kinds of different terms for the father of lies that would employ a term that is more familiar in common parlance and that has evil associations to it that extend beyond the borders of believing Christians. While the Antichrist is probably not going to have positive associations with anyone, including non-Christians, it's not going to have the same negative connotation that Satan or Lucifer would, not just for Christians, but for non-Christians as well. And as the West becomes increasingly non-Christian, the synonym for evil that needs to be opposed, if it's not shed entirely of its spiritual connotations, is going to have a lot more purchase using a term like Lucifer or Satan than the Antichrist. And so that's what sticks in my craw. Again, I'm probably being overly cynical here, or potentially being overly cynical here, but I think Jeff was getting at it when he was speculating that this push for a high-profile lecture series in a part of the country that's not particularly interested in the intricacies of Christian theology, that is putatively private but is getting international attention. I think that it is no coincidence that Peter Thiel's strong association with J.D. Vance is at play here, because this is a clear way to get the MAGA troops and Heritage Americans in line to ally with the J.D. Vance, Peter Thiel, Palantir side of the elite insurgency fight that is going to continue long after Donald Trump is no longer on the scene.
A force that J.D. Vance is certainly going to have to contend with, and already has been, is the Catholic Church. And J.D. Vance rather famously publicly converted to Catholicism in the last 5 or so years, I believe, after he married his Indian wife Usha, and that has created some tension, which spilled out into the open a few weeks ago when J.D. Vance was at a Turning Points Q&A session, and somebody asked him about the potential conflict presented by J.D. Vance being married to a Hindu. And basically J.D. Vance said, that's something that, I've worked out. We've come to an arrangement, but I hope that she converts. I hope that she becomes a Christian. And so he's also tangled with the Pope, both the deceased Pope Francis and the current Pope Leo. J.D. Vance referenced Ordo Amoris, which is a Catholic doctrine, which J.D. Vance's interpretation essentially was that you have concentric circles of obligation to people around you, and that you have a greater obligation to your family and friends, and then it extends out to nation and then foreign nations. So essentially, I would say he was presenting as a hierarchy of obligations of love, and he was directly contradicted and reprimanded by both Pope Francis and Pope Leo, who said that essentially J.D. Vance is wrong about that doctrine. And then, so that was, and J.D. Vance also accused, I think early on, I want to say January of this year, of 2025, accused the Catholic charities, or one of the Catholic Church entities, of basically being motivated by financial motivation, that's why they were opposing the Trump administration's crackdown on illegal immigration, was because they were the Catholic charities organizations were going to suffer financially if the funding was cut off. And in fact, the decades-long contracts for the United States Catholic bishops, contracts for resettlement assistance to government-approved refugees, were not only canceled abruptly, but payment for services already provided was withheld. So the Trump administration cut off funding for Catholic refugee resettlement programs and other illegal immigration assistance programs. And that money was belatedly restored. So the latest iteration of perhaps an escalation is this statement that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops issued. So I'm reading from their statement issued on November 12th, 2025. This was, to give a little context before we delve into the message, the special pastoral message itself. This was approved at the Fall Plenary Assembly in Baltimore, and the last time a message of this kind was issued was in 2013 in response to the federal government's contraceptive mandate. This was shortly after Obamacare was passed, and there was back and forth on how much insurance companies would be required to provide regarding contraception, and the Catholic Church came out strongly against mandated contraceptive coverage. And so this 2025 November statement on immigration received 216 votes in favor and only 5 votes against, and then 3 abstentions. So the overwhelming number of the U.S. Catholic bishops approved this special message. So we're gonna delve into that now. Quoting from the message: "As pastors, we, the bishops of the United States, are bound to our people by ties of communion and compassion in our Lord Jesus Christ. We are disturbed when we see among our people a climate of fear and anxiety around questions of profiling and immigration enforcement. We are saddened by the state of contemporary debate and the vilification of immigrants." Right away, there is deception in this message, because the bishops are conflating the term immigrant with illegal alien. The term immigrant has a very specific meaning in U.S. law. It is a foreign national admitted to the U.S. to live permanently. And an alien is any person not a U.S. citizen or national. And the actual term that is used in statutes and regulation, unauthorized or illegal alien, an alien present in the United States without admission or in violation of visa terms. That is the correct term for the people that this message is referring to. It is illegal alien. But the bishops are cynically using the term immigrant, which has a much more positive association. And when people hear the term immigrant, they associate that with somebody who has the right to be here, who is lawfully present. And so your ancestors who maybe were here at the time of the Mayflower or came more recently through Ellis Island, they are no different. They have the same status or right to be here as an illegal alien, one of millions that the Biden administration let in a few years ago from Venezuela. They are erasing the difference between those groups.
That's the insinuation for sure that they are trying to get at, but they, at least up to this point, will not explicitly advocate for the ignoring of federal immigration laws because there is no scriptural standing to violate what the legitimate authorities of societies, of countries, have to say about migration patterns. The scriptural answer here in terms of what the church should do legally is crystal clear, and that is that it should advocate that laws be followed and that laws be enforced. And so what they're trying to get at is to insinuate strongly that there needs to be a change in the law, but they won't explicitly say that the law should be violated, even though they do think the law is morally illegitimate. They won't say that because they don't have any theological standing to do so.
You're correct that they do not directly advocate for violating or subverting U.S. law, but they come about as close as you can possibly get without directly saying it. And it's a very passive-aggressive, cowardly way of giving themselves plausible deniability. But the clear, obvious, I'm going to argue, obvious implication of this message is that the vigorous enforcement of existing law is immoral and is anti-Christian, is unchristian, and that the laws should be enforced, if at all, be enforced as enforced only when there is essentially no alternative. And certainly there should not be a vigorous enforcement of immigration law. And the direct recommendation or exhortation of this message is that the existing laws be changed. Well, if the existing laws, the entire framework needs to be fundamentally changed, you are saying that the existing laws are immoral. So quoting again from this message, Catholic teaching exhorts nation to recognize the fundamental dignity of all persons, including immigrants. We bishops advocate for a meaningful reform of our nation's immigration laws and procedures. There is one paragraph where they give a begrudging pro forma nod to advocates for enforcement of immigration laws, quoting, "We recognize that nations have a responsibility to regulate their borders and establish a just and orderly immigration system for the sake of the common good. Without such processes, immigrants face the risk of trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Safe and legal pathways serve as an antidote to such risks." So the implication is that, well, the only reason we should have well-regulated borders is for the benefit of the immigrants. Again, they're not immigrants, illegal aliens. Essentially, we should convert the illegal aliens into immigrants because that would be best for them. There's no mention of the benefit that these aliens or immigrants will provide to the United States. That's not even a consideration.
I think you're giving them entirely too much credit because the framework that you're setting up there would make sense if we were currently in a state where there was a immigration moratorium in place. But of course, there already are plenty of processes for migrants, aspiring immigrants to enter the country legally. The merits and demerits of the current immigration system being a separate discussion, there currently are several ways for people to legally enter the country. And so they're creating, all through insinuation, as Jeff mentioned, because they won't explicitly advocate for what they actually want to have happen, which is for the United States federal immigration laws to be ignored, if not overturned immediately, then ignored until they can be overturned. They're creating this straw man as though the people who are, as they would characterize it, being treated poorly are, through, again, insinuation, are legal migrants following all of the laws. But in reality, the people who are being treated in ways that they would perceive as being harshly conducted are the people who are in blatant violation of federal immigration law. And so that's the rub. And so they can't say any of this explicitly. They can just imply and intentionally sow confusion such that the association is that the people for whom deportation proceedings are occurring are people who are here legally, and it's only through some sort of caprice or bigotry of the administration that they're being thrown out in an illegal way. But that's not the case, and they can't explicitly say that it's the case. And I think a backdrop to this, it's important to keep in mind that the U.S. Conference of Bishops doesn't devote 1/1000th of the energy that they are demonstrating here in opposition to real societal sins like abortion and same-sex marriage and the various manifestations of gender bending, all things that are clearly scriptural, biblical sins that are currently permitted in U.S. federal and state law. While there could conceivably be good faith, scriptural, biblical arguments made in favor of lessening immigration restrictions, there is zero scriptural evidence for the sort of permissive legal view of abortion that characterizes virtually all of the Christian world or post-Christian world today. And the church, while it does maintain a pro-life stance, doesn't fight nearly as hard, advocate nearly as publicly for things that are much more clear-cut theologically than the question of immigration is.
To your point, Ness, about the discrepancy in the enthusiasm with which the Catholic Church speaks out against issues opposing abortion or opposing transgenderism, so contrasting that with the enthusiasm with which they speak out against immigration issues, it's clear to me that the church reluctantly opposes, for instance, transgenderism, and they're almost embarrassed about doing it. So back to the letter. The church's teaching rests on the foundational concern for the human person, as created in the image and likeness of God, Genesis 1, verse 27. As pastors, we look to sacred scripture and the example of the Lord himself, where we find the wisdom of God's compassion. The priority of the Lord, as the prophets remind us, is for those who are most vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the poor, and the stranger. In the Lord Jesus, we see the one who became poor for our sake. The church's concern for neighbor and our concern here for immigrants is a response to the Lord's command to love as he has loved us. And so again, without saying it directly, the clear implication of this is that if you support the Trump administration, which millions and millions of American Catholics do, who voted for Trump, if you support what the Trump administration is doing on immigration, you are violating the Lord's command. You are violating God and Jesus' command. Continuing from the message, quote, "We note with gratitude that so many of our clergy, consecrated religious, and lay faithful already accompany and assist immigrants in meeting their basic human needs. We urge all people of goodwill to continue and expand such efforts," end quote. So again, this is about as close as you can get to sedition, I would argue, or the bishops calling for subversion of the laws. Because, again, they won't ever, many of the things they just won't come out and say directly, but they are saying that anybody who can essentially throw sticks in the gears and to slow down and to subvert the enforcement of existing laws should continue to do so, and those efforts should be stepped up.
And that, at the risk of bearing the lead, is a perfect segue into understanding the more historical understanding of the term Antichrist and how it has been deployed by Christian thinkers, and that is the idea primarily of subversion from within the church, assuming the title and the spiritual authority of the church to undermine what Christians are actually called to do in the world. It's worth taking a second here, I think, to understand the term Antichrist and how it is distinct from Satan or from Lucifer. I think the simplest way is by way of analogy to think of the Antichrist is to Satan what the Pope or any prophets are to God, in that the Antichrist is not some supernatural being, but it is an agent of the devil that is existing in the world to subvert the will of God and the well-being of Christians and of all souls. Jeff talked a little bit about Antichrist in terms of the existence of that term scripturally, and it's quite scant. But while the Bible itself only mentions Antichrist a handful of times, it was a driving idea behind the Reformation. In particular, Martin Luther, I looked it up on AI to see how many times he employed the term Antichrist in his writings. And after giving several bullet points about the various ways that he used the term in writing and lectures and in communications with other people, it finished by summarizing thus. Quote, Martin Luther did not mention the Antichrist a fixed, countable number of times. Rather, he repeatedly and consistently referred to the papacy as the Antichrist throughout his writings, sermons, and public statements. The concept was a central part of his eschatology and his justification for the Reformation, unquote. And that is where the relevancy of the term comes in my view, contemporaneously. That is, it's going to increasingly be something that pious Christians are going to have to face. Protestants, yes, but even more acutely Catholics, in challenging the very obvious anti-Christian actions and proclamations of the designated leaders of those churches, of those institutions. There is, of course, Protestant history, Protestant precedents for this, but in Catholicism, it's much more scant. The idea is that to be a good Christian, to be a good Catholic, one must submit to the teachings of the church. And this can get into the doctrine of papal infallibility and the idea that whatever the Catholic Church says is binding Christian doctrine. And that's a big ask, to put it moderately, to understate the case. I see Jeff over there shaking his head at the idea that Catholics could be asked to do this. But of course, Catholics have done this before. Martin Luther was a Catholic. Perhaps you could say he was never a Catholic from the Catholic perspective, but he was a pious, believing Catholic at the time, and as were Protestants at the time and subsequent, such that they constitute now almost half of all self-identified Christians worldwide. And of course, there are plenty of questions of heretical teachings and antichrist subversion in Protestant denominations, but to take a Lutheran terminology and apply it here, the idea of sola scriptura, there is much stronger scriptural evidence for the idea that at many times and places that false teachers, false prophets, subversives, anti-Christian agents of Satan, for example, just to use something apropos of what we're talking about here with the term Antichrist, there are countless scriptural illustrations of this taking place and God commanding faithful believers to effectively overthrow the current corrupt manifestation of Satanism dressed up as Christianity. For example, Ezekiel chapter 43, quote, "The people of Israel will never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings at their death. When they placed their threshold next to my threshold and their doorposts beside my doorposts, with only a small wall between me and them, they defiled my holy name by their detestable practices. So I destroyed them in my anger. Now let them put away from me their prostitution and the funeral offerings for their kings, and I will then live among them forever," unquote. In our modern Judeo-Christian age, it's often mentioned that Jews are the chosen people of God, and so therefore they have some sort of special place in the Christian conception of the reality of the spiritual world. And yet there were 12 tribes. Everyone is probably familiar with the idea of the 12 tribes of Israel. And of course, only 2 of them survived. The other 10 were scattered to the winds, if not wiped off the face of the earth entirely. And so the idea that God just chooses some institution and then lets that institution operate infallibly without any consequence is totally in contrast to what happens again and again and again throughout Scripture. That wasn't just in the Old Testament either. Of course, Jesus in the New Testament and the Gospels is coming to do exactly that, to overturn the current religious trappings, because they are, rather than being spiritual, are exactly the opposite. They're subversive, and that the Pharisees in many ways are worse than the common practitioners who have very little understanding of Scripture and what they are compelled morally to do. And since we're talking about the Antichrist and we've talked about Lucifer and Satan here, of course, who is Satan in the Christian conception? He is one of the most, it depends on how it's interpreted, either the most high or one of the most high archangels of God, who is chosen by God to be an archangel and then turns on God's creation. There is, of course, another example in one of the 12 disciples, just chosen to be a disciple of Christ and slated to be an apostle post-crucifixion of Christ, and that's Judas, who then betrays Jesus. And so the idea that these chosen people, these chosen institutions are infallible, and that is the scriptural or Christian mandate, that irrespective of how they act, once they've been put in place, well, that status is reserved for exactly one person in all of Christian theology, and that's Jesus Christ, and no one else. So it'll sound audacious, like there's a lot of chutzpah here, but the issue is going to be, the question that's going to be raised for believing Christians in the future, and for Catholics in particular, who has ultimate authority in your life? When the Pope disagrees, when the current Pope disagrees with Jesus Christ, which side do you come down on? That's a question that Christians are going to be asked in the future. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.